Hello again. Welcome to the final lecture video of the Mass Media and American Politics Module 3. And in this video, I want to relate not only the textbook to what we're doing this module, but also I want to go over what your three options are for your essay for this module and how you might use some of the material in these chapters, as well as the Chomsky and Adorno et al. To adorn your arguments and your evidence. So to begin, so before I get to some of the content up here, let me go over what those three questions are. So again, you have to choose one of the following questions for your 750 word response worth 15% of your final course grade. So these are the three questions. In recent years, local news has surpassed network news as the major source of public affairs programming. From one scholarly perspective on the news media, this is utterly predictable. Describe this perspective. And there's no one answer necessarily, but the sort of predominant tendency, one perspective that I've been sharing with you this time around is this kind of Chomsky and Adorno framework of social critique. But also your book is a little bit more attentive to the kind of standard communication scholars and political science arguments about the either minimal consequences of media effects or at the very least, some of the different ways in which media have effects that are measurable in a more kind of concrete and less abstract way. And so the one scholarly perspective, I would say you could either use the Chomsky-Adorno perspective or the political science perspective or the standard kind of communications perspective. But from one scholarly perspective, it's utterly predictable that a more kind of market-oriented, profit-oriented news model will necessitate that local news is going to be incentivized to grow, maybe at the expense of national news, because local news, kind of panders to people's is able to say, for example, in Sacramento, oh well, we go to the city of Elk Grove tonight, or we go to the kind of neighborhood of Land Park tonight, or the city of Davis, or something like that. And they tend to kind of make things locally focused because that's their job, but also they tend to be very kind of institutionally oriented. So they rely on cheap and fast and easy reporting, and sometimes that's a reliance on police departments or courts that they have relationships with. In terms of crime reporting, which is a huge part of what they do, but also, city council and, in the case of Sacramento, state government reporting as well. But then also, anything that's sort of sensational and kind of certainly violence-oriented, but also advertising-oriented and kind of locally focused. So all of that stuff makes it so that you want to be well-informed about local advertising, but because it's sort of so cheap to produce, they end up in order to stay profitable, they rely heavily on advertising, and a lot of news stations have been getting bought up by larger conglomerates that seek to make them profitable, like Sinclair. And so I'll put a little video about Sinclair on the website. And so you can kind of make your own argument about this, but I just wanted to give you a leg up in terms of being able to see that this is a problem that's foreseen in terms of what the incentive structure is by both the Chomsky and Adorno and the political science literature. But I need you to really choose one. So another one is the mass media has replaced political parties as the principal intermediaries between candidates and voters. How has this change transformed the candidates' campaign strategies? And in a word, it just means trying to get free media. So this is probably the best, maybe overused example at this point, would have to be the most recent national campaign that's in the past, and that's the Donald Trump campaign. And in 2015, the way that he was able to win the presidency ultimately is that he used his strategy of his media attention grabbing skills to be able to take the media and look at their incentive structure and say, hey, I'm just going to say the most outlandish things that I can, and provoke a lot of arguments on this debate stage with other Republicans. So I'm going to make people watch the debates, and I'm going to make people watch me, and I'm going to make people, anticipating the next thing that I have to say. And so even though he was not an established politician, he certainly had his own widespread name recognition. And so he was able to use the media, frankly, as his campaign tool. And a lot of the studies that bear this out have done simple counting in terms of the amount of minutes on the nightly news that are devoted to Donald Trump coverage. And they dwarfed anything by, pardon me, any of the other candidates. So this goes to not only the kind of Adorno and Chomsky argument about the media being able to just over rely on ratings and how it is ultimately a distraction from. There is a tendency to in the media lean away from hard news reporting and towards entertainment news reporting, and this was exploiting that kind of negative incentive about news is part of what the Trump campaign was able to do. But then also from the perspective of political science, they say that it's a framing effect, and which we'll talk about briefly in a minute. But it's a framing effect. It doesn't tell people what to think. The media, it tells them what to think about, because the more they focus minutes and time and column inches and radio minutes on a certain subject, the more people will think about it. And this is borne out by the fact that, even though, let me preface this by saying that, September 11th was a terrible tragedy, and in 2001, and the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were obviously the largest wars undertaken since Vietnam by the U.S., and they were newsworthy. However, the fact that most people, graded the threat of terrorism 3 times over the threat of the economy to their well-being was vastly out of step with the day-to-day priorities of most people. But people voted on that issue as opposed to others in the 2004 presidential election. So this is because the amount of minutes devoted on nightly news and other sources was so disproportionately weighted towards the war on terrorism that it was all people could think about. And so they voted on that basis, despite their kind of day-to-day concerns, aside from the nightly news, were not really about it at all. So how has this transformed candidates' campaign strategies? And I think you can almost rephrase that as how have they sought to exploit this new reality? And the Trump campaign has done this, but I'd like to see if you can kind of generalize beyond just the Trump campaign to other, not just presidential campaigns, but either state or local campaigns that you've seen. And it doesn't have to be a wide divergence. Again, this is only a 4-page paper, but if you can just if you can take a look at a general tendency beyond, but including, of course, the Trump campaign in 2016 and possibly 2020 as well. But you can include other presidential campaigns that have some obvious lessons. But if you don't know any, kind of falling back on the Trump campaign should be okay. Using Vietnam and the Iraq War as your endpoints, trace the evolution of deferential journalism in the arena of national security. In terms of deferential journalism, I think that's maybe not. I think I might not even include that as a potential essay. I think I might replace that as an essay. It doesn't quite belong here. But in any event, maybe you can. There's one more paper just on the difference between the kind of Adorno Horkheimer perspective and the more standard issue political science perspective. That might be a better use of your time. So So the Vietnam War and the deferential journalism thing, maybe they just aren't suited to this unit. So I'm going to scratch that as a question. Okay, so we've gone through the Chomsky and Adorno arguments already, but what I want to do is take you through a couple of the main points, and this is going to be very brief, but it's just to kind of give you an idea of how you might use some of these effects in your essay question. So first of all, one thing that some of you will already be familiar with is this choice of methods in the way to study media effects, and this does influence the way that both political science and larger social science studies the media and maybe even sees what the effects are, and there's a lot of evidence that's persuasive that demonstrates that a more reliable source of information is really experiments, with people's willing participation to see what the effects of various kinds of media reporting are. The most famous, perhaps, that's actually mentioned in the textbook is part of what I based my own doctoral dissertation on, was the work done by Tally Mendelberg about the 1988 George Bush campaign and the reliance on on the kind of centering of attention on a felon who had been on a weekend kind of furlough, which is a kind of pass that ultimately ended up assaulting a couple in Maryland, even though he was from Massachusetts. And the reason why this matters is because it activated, and the theory was that it activated racial prejudice in people that already had some racial prejudice. And it's called a priming effect, a racial priming effect on people who already had some kind of latent bias against people of minority races, as well as an anti-civil rights kind of stance and an anti-social welfare kind of stance. It primed that, meaning that just because you have that belief doesn't mean that's going to be the way you focus your political action. And it made people, when they saw these political campaign ads that were simply that didn't even mention the word race or any kind of racial categorization, when they saw certain ads that many scholars argued were deliberately made to make people focus on racial differences, it did actually. There is persuasive evidence from her campaign, from her research, Tally Mendelberg's research, that once people saw an ad like that, it activated that racial prejudice in a way that was kind of weaponized and politicized. So the question is really whether that media effect is more widespread than a simple, one-off experiment. And the problem is that with experiments, it's very hard outside of the kind of tight confines of the experiment itself, where you can manipulate the independent variable, which would be, the media campaign itself, and the dependent variable, which is the actual effect it has on people, and whether or not that's important enough, the finding from that experiment, to be able to generalize about it, to be able to say, well, because in this one instance or this set of instances that we controlled that are supposed to be representative of the real world, because it happened this way there, we think that it can happen and does happen in much the same way in the wider political world. So that becomes, you see how difficult that kind of scaling up of findings can be. So that's why in another kind of perspective, surveys tend to be much more widely relied upon. The problem with surveys is that there's something called social desirability bias. And that social desirability bias influences the way, even in anonymous surveys, people answer questions because they want the questioner, or even just the person who is reading their responses, to think that they're a good person, and to think that they are socially acting responsibly in some way. So, that explains a lot of why many voter surveys will have an overrepresentation of the number of people who voted. So even though the ceiling of American participation in presidential elections is something like maybe 62% of registered or eligible voters, typically it's more like 77% of people in surveys say that they voted in a typical year. So that's a big difference. It's certainly a significant difference, and that kind of explains social desirability. So anyway, so experiments are thought to be more reliable simply because they get at a little bit more of the truth. But surveys, it's not as if social desirability bias totally zeroes out the reliability of surveys. There's ways that you can ask questions in a more kind of veiled fashion to get at the truth of how the media is having an effect on people's thinking. So the question, one question certainly is whether we can go as far as Chomsky and Herman, and earlier a person I've neglected to mention is public opinion author Walter Lippmann from the 1920s. He was a radio personality and writer who was a journalist, and so he wasn't in the same kind of academic profession that Adorno and Horkheimer and Chomsky and Herman were. But he talks about American media and is involved in the business of manufacturing consent of the masses to participate in society and in the economy. And that's just an outright theory. It's kind of a bold statement, and he didn't have a lot of evidence he had some evidence to base it on, but not in a social science kind of systematic kind of way. And so the question is whether you can test for that, whether there's a way whether that's falsifiable, whether that's something that in social science is something that you can provide evidence for or prove in some way. And there's a lot to be said for the fact that even in so some media effects have begun to be a little bit more difficult to measure in surveys because social desirability bias itself is changing, and what else has changed? Because of the one hypothesis, which is the partisan polarization hypothesis. And the partisan polarization hypothesis is simply, it's another function of this selective exposure hypothesis, that people drift towards media that reinforce their worldview, their ideology, if you will. And because of that, because of this polarization that's happening, there's a twisted funhouse mirror through which everyone seems to view American politics, and unfortunately, that social desirability becomes very distorted in terms of what the consensus view of politics maybe used to be, which is through ideally maybe a more just straight up mirror as opposed to funhouse mirror. Because people only have about an hour's worth of attention every day to the news. That actually sounds like a lot, but if you can think about it today, but the fact is that over 80% of people rely on social media for their primary news gathering of the day, their primary news intake of the day. It's sometimes called the news hole. It's just the amount of time that people can actually devote to paying attention to the day's news outside of their own world. And whether it's TV or radio or paper or online, there's a graph in your textbook, I believe in chapter 5, that talks about, that just shows you that the sum total of minutes is about 55 minutes that people will pay attention to the news. And over the years, the line that is TV has gone down, radio has gone down, paper has gone down, but online has gone up. But the sum total hasn't changed. So that's important to realize. This is just because there's more information, it's not being processed in a more sophisticated way. It's certainly being processed in a different kind of way. Because online doesn't just mean instead of reading the New York Times, you read the New York Times online. It means you might get a fragment of a headline from the New York Times. You might see 10 times the number of articles from the New York Times in your news feed on, whether it's, and I'm going to make myself a dinosaur by mentioning social media platforms, but okay, fine. So Facebook and Twitter and I don't know how Snapchat works, but all the other social media that distribute news, all of them, rely on this ability of people to just clip through and see what they want to see in terms of the preferences of who they're following, but then also, pay attention to subjects that already interest them, and will click through to things that will validate their worldview. So whether or not something is factually accurate is less important than people, just wanting to pay attention to it. So the media itself has an enormous degree of influence, and always has, but the way that they are configuring their campaigns to get people to pay attention to them is certainly different and configured in a much more kind of visceral way than perhaps they even used to be. And I'm not saying there was ever a golden age, but whatever age that was, it's a little demonstrably worse now in terms of trying to get hard news through to people on a regular basis. So one thing that's mentioned in your book that's, I think, important to see is that right here I just have political participation both online and offline is dependent really on your socioeconomic status, meaning either your income level or the combination of your income level and your education level. Both your online and your offline participation kind of time go up as you move up the kind of social ladder. Perhaps because you have more interest, because you sort of have more of a financial stake, or you've had more education about it, or maybe you just have more time because you have more leisure time, or you just have more energy because you do less kind of service-oriented work, and you're doing more kind of what they used to call white-collar kind of work. So anyway, so this online and offline participation thing, I think, is important in the context of our conversation about how the media has an effect on people, just because it kind of shows you that there are different maybe motives that people have for getting involved in media as you go up or down that kind of very crude socioeconomic ladder. But these sort of move on to the final kind of summary of chapter 8. There's a summary that talks specifically about some of these more social scientific effects of the media on the general population. One of them is just learning, and the way that people learn is certainly influenced by the media. And I would venture to say that the media from teenage years on, and possibly younger, has a much more definitive effect on people's worldview than their education does. And so the media itself is an enormously important. I'll stop saying The media itself is an enormously important independent variable in the way that we see the world. And just because we can't always define the media in a consistent way, I think those external kind of technologically oriented mass distribution information sources, are much more persuasive on how we think and feel and prioritize our lives. And I'm not just talking about the news, I'm talking about entertainment as well. Social media is included in this, but it's not definitive. So all of those are more important than what your teacher is telling you, or even the friends you make in school, or even your family, perhaps. So So the media is so important as a socializing agent and thus as a politicizing agent that we are at our peril not thinking of it as an extremely important political independent variable that demonstrates how much we learn in the world. Now, one thing that is important to note is that in social science, one flaw of it, especially in the survey research, is that they rather narrowly look at political advertising as a last minute determinant of how much people are persuaded to vote for one candidate or another. And that's kind of the one thing that opens chapter 8 I'm very frustrated with, simply because I think Iyengar talks too much about the fact that a certain sector of political science and communication studies and mass media studies have focused on whether political campaign television ads make a difference in terms of people's last minute choices for voting, and because the consensus is that there are minimal effects. Well, I think overemphasizing the minimal effects hypothesis or theory or finding is misleading quite frankly to students of this discipline and this subject, because you are ignoring the vast amount of politicization that is inherent in the way that the media reports its the independent news media and the mass media configure politics into their day-to-day decisions about what to air and what to market to people. So just because political campaign effects might be minimal and advertising might be minimal, that's only because they're quick and they're only a small part of what people take in, and the fact that they have any effect at all speaks to their enormous kind of persuasive power. But what the real kind of political question is, or set of questions, is how much the news media primes people to vote about things and think about things that they otherwise would not have much time for, and really how they frame those things. And so not just the news media, but the entertainment industry about whether to think about. For example, this year, race has become, and racial differences and divisions have become much more central to the political conversation in a way that perhaps they weren't even last year, and certainly weren't before 2012. A lot of people thought that we were or at least during the Obama presidency, there was a lot of emphasis on the fact that maybe we were entering a new era of kind of racial consensus in this country. But I think this year we've been really woken up to the fact that there's a lot of media attention about this issue, and people are at least thinking more about it than they used to, and maybe they're voting about it in a way that they didn't before. And finally, is there? Oh, I'm sorry, not finally, but I'll come back to agenda setting. And do they have a persuasive effect? And there have been enough media studies saying that the media, and when I say the media again, news media and mass media, entertainment industry media, has some persuasive effect. So the question is, finally, really, is about agenda setting. And all of this kind of really leads to this. And so this should be a lot more central. Maybe I should circle it, but I seem to have lost my pen. So agenda setting is really what the mass media does. They make you think about what you maybe wouldn't be otherwise thinking about, and they frame it in a certain way that you'll think about it in a way that will really set the political agenda. And they might even prime you to wake up a latent political opinion that you didn't have in either a positive or negative way, depending on the context. So the media itself is I think what the reason I named this module kind of defining reality was simply because there is no other way to view the media than a central political player in day-to-day politics in the United States, in a way that Chomsky and Herman and Adorno talked about, but also in a way that is studied in a more piecemeal way in political science and communication studies more conventionally. So I'll be excited to see the way that you wrestle with this question, and I look forward to having a conversation about it in class if you have some questions. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you then.